The locals in Pine Hollow always said the woods sounded wrong at night. They didn't use words like haunted or cursed. Those words imply ghosts, remnants of things that used to be alive. No, the word they used was wrong. Like the forest itself was an active participant in the silence, stretching its perimeter to listen to your footsteps. For generations, the residents of the valley ignored the old timber worker stories. They dismissed them as the vivid imaginations of lonely loggers. Until the late 90s, when the landscape began to claim people without leaving a trace. The first official file belongs to a veteran tracker who went missing in the late autumn of 1998. When search teams finally located his equipment 2 miles from his base camp, they found his rifle resting perfectly upright against a cedar trunk. The safety was still engaged. There was no struggle, no blood trail, and no footprints in the soft mud. Not even his own. It was as if he had simply unburdened himself of his weapon and stepped off the face of the earth. Then came the reports that the local sheriff's department refused to log. Hikers, hunters, and rangers all began reporting the same auditory anomaly deep within the wilderness. They heard family members calling out from the thickets, grandfathers who had been buried for a decade, children who were currently safe at home, or spouses begging for assistance just 50 yards off the trail. But every single encounter followed an identical, terrifying progression. The voice would sound perfectly normal at first. Then, as the listener drew closer, the cadence would falter. The spacing between the words would stretch. The tone would drop into a flat, mechanical drone. The voice never belonged to a real person. It was just a lure. My name is Daniel Mercer, and 3 years ago my friends and I were in Pine Hollow. We learned the hard way that some legends aren't meant to be investigated. There were 5 of us that weekend. Me, my younger brother Tyler, and our closest friends from college, Emma, Josh, and Nate. It was supposed to be our final transition trip before the real world scattered us across the country. Corporate jobs, cross-country moves, the end of youth. We drove 4 hours north of Truckee into a jagged pocket of the mountains known as Pine Hollow. It's an area completely devoid of infrastructure. No cellular grid, no paved roads, no managed camp tracks. Just miles of overgrown logging routes from the 1950s and trees so dense they block out the sky. It is the kind of geographic bowl where acoustics bounce and amplify in ways that play tricks on your ears. We arrived right as the sun was dipping behind the ridge, casting long, orange geometric lines through the pines. At first, it looked like a postcard, beautiful, crisp, and isolated. But the moment the truck engine died, a crushing weight settled over the clearing. Tyler noticed it before anyone else. He stopped halfway through unloading his rucksack, his head tilted toward the tree line. He looked at me and asked, "Why is it so quiet?" That's when the realization hit me like cold water. The forest was entirely devoid of life. There were no birds settling into the canopy, no crickets in the brush, no small game moving through the dry leaves. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was artificial. It felt as though every living creature had fled the valley hours before we arrived, leaving the space entirely empty. Or worse, waiting. Emma tried to break the tension, joking that our bad driving had scared off the wildlife. Nobody laughed. We pitched our tents around a pre-existing stone fire pit at the edge of the clearing. Looking at those charred old stones didn't make me feel safe. It made me realize we were sitting in a trap that had been used before. By 10 p.m., A dense, low-hanging fog rolled out from the timberline. It didn't obscure everything, but it blurred the boundaries of our camp, making the trees look like massive, distant figures rather than stationary wood. We sat close to the heat, drinking cheap beer and trying to keep the conversation light. Josh started doing what he always does when he's uncomfortable. He started telling cheesy internet horror stories. He was throwing out every cliche he could think of to get a rise out of Emma. Bigfoot sightings, ancient curses, forest spirits. That's when Nate stopped staring at the fire and spoke up. His voice was completely serious. He told us about his uncle, a man who used to log this specific valley in the 70s, who had explicitly warned him about something the old-timers called the Pine Hollow Mimic. Emma rolled her eyes, letting out a loud sigh. But Nate didn't flinch. He leaned forward and said his uncle's primary rule for survival in these mountains was absolute. If you hear a voice in the dark, you never answer, even if it sounds like your own blood. Josh let out a loud, mocking laugh. What? So we're hiding from a giant parrot out here? I'll never forget the way Nate looked at him across the embers. His face was completely blank. He whispered, "It doesn't copy you right away, Josh. First, it just sits out there. It listens to your tone, it maps your vocabulary, it practices." The laughter died instantly. The fire felt a lot smaller after that. Around midnight, Tyler and Emma called it a night and retreated to their respective tents. That left me, Josh, and Nate sitting around a dying bed of coals, watching the fog turn the edges of our vision into a gray haze. Then the acoustic landscape changed. From deep within the northwest quadrant of the woods, a voice carried across the valley. It was thin, reedy, and weak. "Help." The three of us stood up simultaneously. Josh immediately reached for his heavy Maglite flashlight. It sounded like an injured hiker, someone who had wandered off the trail miles away. Then it came again. But the distance had halved in a matter of seconds. "Please, I can't move." Josh took a step toward the brush, but Nate grabbed his jacket sleeve with enough force to rip the stitching. Nate's face wasn't pale. It was gray. He was shaking his head, his eyes locked on the dark line where the fog met the trunks. Then the entity spoke for a third time. It was barely 20 yards away now, hidden just behind a massive, rotting cedar. "Josh," the air left my lungs. The voice was an absolute, flawless replication of Emma. It had her exact nasal tone, her specific regional inflection. Josh turned his flashlight directly toward her tent. The zipper was secure. The fabric was completely still. He lunged forward, ripping the tent flap open in a panic. Emma was inside, wrapped in her sleeping bag, her eyes blinking open in total confusion. She was completely safe. Before Josh could even form a sentence to apologize, a sound tore through the camp from the darkness behind her tent. "Josh, help me! It's in here!" It was Emma's voice, but it was coming from the trees, delivered with a terrifying, unnatural volume that made the metal tent poles vibrate. Inside the tent, the real Emma let out a sharp cry, her hands flying over her ears. She was listening to herself scream from the dark. The entire camp descended into chaos. Tyler emerged from his tent, his eyes wide with terror, asking who was outside. But before we could answer, the woods responded to him. "Tyler, come out here. It's cold." It was Tyler's own voice, reflected back at him like a distorted mirror. It was missing the breath behind the words, sounding flat, like a digital recording played through an old speaker. Josh began frantically sweeping his flashlight beam through the fog. The light caught something between two large ponderosa pines. It wasn't an animal, it was a silhouette. Tall, impossibly thin, standing easily 8 or 9 feet high. But its torso was warped, bending at angles that defied human anatomy, its limbs twitching with a strange, jerky kinetic energy. The creature didn't stop. It began to run a perimeter around our tents, its heavy footsteps making the ground vibrate under our boots. As it circled us, it began to rapidly cycle through our names, switching the voices mid-sentence. Tyler, Emma, Daniel, Josh. And then it hit a frequency that made my stomach drop into an absolute abyss. Daniel, honey, come back to the car. It was my mother's voice. My mother had died in a hospital in Sacramento 6 years prior. This thing wasn't just copying what it heard tonight. It was digging into the residual echoes of the names we had spoken, trying on different personalities like a man sorting through old clothes. Nate completely broke. He grabbed a heavy steel fire poker from the woodpile, stepped to the edge of the clearing, and screamed into the fog, "Leave us alone! Get back!" The entire valley went dead silent. The footsteps stopped. The voices ceased. The fog seemed to freeze in place. Then came the response. It was a laugh, but it didn't come from one throat. It was a multi-tonal, overlapping track of all our voices laughing at the exact same time. Josh's chuckle, Emma's gasp, my mother's soft giggle, all stitched together into a grotesque, discordant chorus that echoed off the granite walls of the hollow. Something struck the rear wall of Emma's tent with the force of a moving vehicle. The fabric groaned, and Emma screamed as she was thrown toward the center of the enclosure. Josh ran to her, dragging her out into the open clearing. When we shined the flashlight onto the back of the tent, there were no tears from claws. Instead, 3 massive grease-like handprints were pressed into the damp nylon. The fingers were thin, elongated lines, extending nearly 14 inches from the palm, with far too many knuckle creases visible in the residue. We didn't talk. We didn't plan. We grabbed our keys and ran toward the truck, abandoning our tents, our gear, and everything we owned. As we stumbled through the dark toward the logging road, the movement followed us from the tree line. It kept perfect pace, matching our strides, its long limbs snapping against the low branches. Right as I reached the passenger door, a final voice whispered from the darkness directly behind my shoulder. It was less than 3 feet away. "Don't leave me behind, Daniel." It sounded exactly like Tyler, but Tyler was already in the back seat of the truck, screaming at me to floor it. Josh dropped his flashlight as he scrambled into the driver's seat. The heavy beam rolled across the forest floor, pointing straight into the brush. In that fleeting, flickering light, I saw the pine hollow mimic clearly. It was a gray, hairless titan, its skin resembling dry, diseased parchment. Its arms were disproportionate, hanging well past its knees, ending in those long, skeletal fingers. But its face, its face was unfinished. It didn't have human features. It had a smooth, clay-like slate where a nose and ears should be. It had 2 dark, sunken cavities containing small yellow eyes that caught the light like a nocturnal predator. As I watched, the flesh around its lower jaw began to split, stretching horizontally into a massive ear-to-ear tear. It was attempting to copy a smile it had seen on one of us, but it didn't understand the anatomy. It was just pulling the meat apart to make the shape. The flashlight battery died. The forest went black. We tore down that mountain road at 60 miles an hour, the truck's suspension screaming over the rocks. Nobody spoke for the entire 4-hour drive back to civilization. Daniel and his friends never returned to Pine Hollow. They left their equipment to rot in the snow, and for 3 years the story remained a private trauma shared only between the 4 survivors. They thought distance would protect them. They thought the entity was bound to the geography of that specific valley. They were wrong. Last year, Josh, the friend who had tried to laugh off the legend, disappeared while on a solo fishing trip in the northern foothills, 300 miles away from Pine Hollow. The authorities located his truck near an abandoned forestry access road. The driver's side door was wide open. The keys were still in the ignition, and the battery had drained to 0. There were no signs of a struggle. But the state investigators recovered a single, partially overwritten voice memo on his smartphone. The audio file was time-stamped at 4:12 a.m. "They're outside the cabin doors. I can hear them in the gravel. They've been calling my name using Daniel's voice for 2 hours. Wait, someone's tapping the glass. I can hear them outside. They sound exactly like me. So do I." The search for Josh was called off after 6 weeks. He is currently listed in the National Missing Persons Database as a suspected wilderness casualty. But Daniel Mercer knows better. Sometimes Daniel still sits in his apartment in the city, listening to the white noise of the traffic outside. He realizes now that the creature in the woods wasn't trying to scare them that night in Pine Hollow. It wasn't an act of malice. It was a study. It was a predator gathering data, learning the nuances of our fear, mapping our voices, and practicing the language of the living, until its performance became flawless. If you are ever traveling through the mountains north of Truckee and you hear your own voice calling to you from the dark, do not answer. Do not run. Because by the time you hear it, the mimic has already learned how to replace you. This has been The Wrong Door. Subscribe, or you might find yourself on the wrong side of the threshold.